Hello again. Here we are. It's Sunday morning at 9:30, and we're at the Santa Cruz Community Church having a morning Bible study, and welcome you folks that are watching us on YouTube. I think I probably confused things a little bit with the way I was dealing with Abraham. There's so many stories. Abraham is the central character of the book of Genesis. Genesis has 50 chapters. And Abraham doesn't come into it until the 12th chapter. The chapters before that are all what I say, the introductory material. And then from there, Abraham dominates the scene. And I wanted, as I taught each time, to kind of get the whole picture of Abraham's experience. So I kind of skipped things. Then the next time we went over it, I added some of those things back in. But here we are. This is the fourth time that we've been studying, and we're at chapter 22, so we're making progress. There are three great final stories about Abraham here that I want to try to cover today, but if I don't get them all covered, it's all right. We'll just pick it up next week. And the first one is the big story. You may have questions or comments about this first one. So, Chapter 22, in chapter 21, we had Abraham, his relationship with the dominant ruler of the area of the southern part of Canaan where he was, who was somebody called Abimelech, who was living down in the plains where later the Philistines lived. And Abraham interacts with him, and they finally make a kind of a pact, a kind of a covenant together that they will be kind to each other. And then chapter 22 begins sometime later. God tested Abraham. Now here we have again the same kind of thing we had with the three visitors. That the writer, presumably Moses, lets us know what this is going to be about, but we're trying to be where Abraham is, and I never know whether God just a voice comes out of the sky that Abraham suddenly hears God speaking, or whether it's a more personal thing than that, whether it's some kind of a vision or some kind of a. But anyway, God speaks to Abraham. He calls him Abraham, and I guess the right thing to do when God calls you, if that should ever happen to you, is to say, "Here I am." That's what Samuel said. Remember, the boy Samuel is sleeping in the temple, and God says, "Samuel," and he thinks it's the priest calling him. Goes to the priest. The priest says, "I didn't call you." So after the third time this happens, the priest said, I think it's not me calling you, it's God calling you. So when he calls, say, "Here I am." So Abraham says, "Here I am." Then God said, now this is it's not only a test of Abraham, it's a test for all of us reading it. "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love." Doesn't leave him any wiggle room here. "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering, on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Now, this "I will tell you about" kind of clues us in that we don't have everything in our text that God actually said to Abraham, and possibly he said some of these things as Abraham was on his journey, but. What a test. I mean, right away we kind of react and think, oh, this is so unfair for God to ask this. But it's a test, and we don't always know what all God has in mind. I've said before that when we read Genesis and the other Old Testament texts, we're sort of getting to know God as he reveals himself. Now, I think that's very important. That we get an idea of how God interacted with people when he was doing so in a more direct way. I would caution you, though, that we tend to think that things should be repeated over and over again. So when God does something, then we sort of think that that should happen again and again. If you read the Old Testament carefully, you see that's not how God operates. He does something once, and that's it. How many people are rescued from a den of lions? Only one. How many people are rescued from the fiery furnace? Well, there's 3 of them, but it's only one occasion. God doesn't repeat things over and over. So you shouldn't look for God to be testing you in some way like he's testing Abraham. And as this happens, we should look for what else is going on here. This is one of these stories that obviously has prophetic significance. So now we do see this is Abraham after having served God for these years, and finally the promise of God is fulfilled, that the child is actually born in their old age. Isaac is there. So God tests Abraham, and what's he testing? He's testing his faith. Now, interestingly, you may immediately say, oh yeah, in the book of James, James is not arguing against Paul. I doubt that James has read Paul's material when he writes this, but he's arguing against the idea that somehow a life of faith has no follow-through, that we just say, well, I believe, and that's it. Then he says, no. How do we know that Abraham believed? By what he did. How do I know that you believe? He's in effect saying, by what you do, by how it affects your life. So he talks about this very incident, that God tested Abraham, and Abraham came through marvelously in what he did. So this is a hard thing, to put yourself in Abraham's position. God has said, I'm going to make of you a great nation. You're going to have children, great-grandchildren, so many of them that they won't even be, you won't even be able to count them. If you could count the sands on the seashore or the stars in the sky, then you could count all of your children. And he says eventually, it doesn't say eventually, I said eventually. He says, you and your seed after you, will change the whole world. So now he says, finally, after all these years of waiting, this great miracle happens that Isaac is born in Sarah's old age. And now God says, take that son, that only son, when he's not talking about Ishmael. Ishmael is gone from the scene now. He says, take Isaac, your only son, whom you love. That's interesting. And sacrifice him to me. Abraham has to say, wait a minute. He's the one through whom I'm supposed to have all this family. He's the only link. He's the child of promise. You said very clearly, all of this promise you've made to me is going to be fulfilled through your only child, Sarah's child. So take that child and sacrifice him. So the test of faith is that Abraham still believes that everything God said will still come true. How? I sort of read this in the same way the Apostle Paul did, which I pat myself on the back if I can read it the same way the Apostle Paul did. But the Apostle Paul says, Abraham knows that God is able even to raise the dead. So should he actually follow through and offer his son as a sacrifice, God somehow will give him back. And so he's not afraid to do this. So, but early the next morning, Abraham doesn't let I'm a terrible procrastinator, but Abraham is not. If he's got this to do, he's going to do it. He's going to do it right away. So early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. Now, they didn't much use horses in this time. They later used horses in warfare. Chariots were pulled by horses. But if you were riding an animal, if you were using an animal for work or recreation or whatever, it was a donkey. Later we have camels mentioned, and I'm reading my archaeology things. The archaeologists are arguing about how early camels were domesticated. They're saying you can't believe that story in the Bible because camels weren't domesticated then. I'm saying if you want to know when camels were domesticated, read the Bible. It'll tell you when camels were domesticated. So he saddles up his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, now talk about a labor of love, a labor of faith. He cuts this wood. He doesn't know whether there'll be wood there. So he cuts this wood. He doesn't want to be bothered gathering wood when he gets there. And he has enough wood for the offering. This sort of implies, I had said earlier that we were told in several places that Abraham built an altar and worshiped God. We're not told specifically what he did to worship God. But here it rather seems that offering animal sacrifices was a regular part of what he did, because he seems to understand. You'd have the impression that he has done this offering of animals in the past. So he sets out. Now, this Mount Moriah, or where Abraham made the sacrifice, becomes an interesting thing. You can't really nail it down as tight as some of the traditions do, and yet this says go to the region of Moriah and to one of the mountains that I will tell you about. So what we seem to see from this is that Jerusalem is a mountain. It's not a rugged mountain like Mount Hermon. It's an old mountain. And it has these 2 peaks in it. One of them is usually called Mount Zion, and the other is often called traditionally Mount Moriah, because the Jews believed, and the Muslims who count all of their connection with this story of Abraham through Ishmael, the Muslims believe that Mount Moriah is where Jerusalem is now. And so, in fact, this mingles in with the stories that Muhammad puts out. And so the rock, the mountain, the place where Abraham actually did this sacrifice is supposed to be that rock that's inside the dome of the rock, where Muhammad is supposed to have ascended to heaven from that rock. I say supposed to because I'm not too impressed with all of this. Anyway, but even the idea of that this was the exact place that Abraham offered the sacrifice. Now, it is interesting that when you read in the time of David, we seem to be talking about this same place, that David had done something that God did not approve of. It seems that he was sort of counting his armies and things as if that was where his strength was. And God said, so I'm going to punish you for this. And what kind of punishment do you want me to give? And finally David says, a plague. The other punishments offered was a defeat by their enemies. David said, no, I'd rather have the plague. Now, the plague isn't hurting David. He's not going to die of the plague. It's hurting the people. So the plague comes and many people die of it. And then finally, David keeps praying, okay, Lord, we've been punished. That's enough. And so God says, okay, go out to this place and build an altar and make a sacrifice. And it traditionally, and this is supposed to be the same place that Abraham made this offering. then we keep reading in the Chronicles and Kings. We see that Solomon built his temple right where David had made this offering to end the plague. It was a flat area. It seems like the plague was moving in waves, and it was moving toward Jerusalem. And he offered this sacrifice, and the plague stopped there. It didn't go on to Jerusalem. So Solomon built his temple there. Now, if you put all that together, as the Jewish people did, you see that God directs Abraham to this special place, which then later becomes the place of the temple. Abraham is offering this unusual sacrifice. It's unusual, I say, because nowhere in the Old Testament does God authorize human sacrifice. Often some of his bitterest things he says is against this one sect that believed in human sacrifice. And yes, you have that interesting story in Judges where the judge said, well, if God gives me victory, the first thing I see when I return home, I will offer as a thanks offering to God. Unfortunately, the first thing he sees is his daughter. So there's argument about, did the text really mean that he sacrificed his daughter? Others say, no, that was never done, and so he didn't do it. If you read the text, it sort of leaves room for you to think that the way he sacrificed his daughter is that she never married. She became kind of a holy person. But anyway, there's not an authorization of human sacrifice in the Old Testament. So this becomes a very significant thing. So he takes Isaac, takes the wood, takes 2 servants with him. One donkey is mentioned. Maybe he took more donkeys so they could all ride. I don't know. He goes to this place. So now he set off for the place God had told him about. So he must have been given much more direction than we have here. Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Now this conversation is very interesting. Either Abraham has deep faith, which I would choose to believe, or he's avoiding telling his servants and telling Isaac what he's about to do. Incidentally, this on the 3rd day. If you're traveling the way they did to get from Hebron, where his main place was, to this place that later is Jerusalem, would take probably about 3 days. I had a commentator years ago that I read that tried to make something really significant. It said every time the Bible talks about 3 days, it's prophetic, because when we get to the crucifixion, Jesus is crucified and on the 3rd day raised from the dead. Maybe I never did the research to see how many places the third day is mentioned, but anyway, this is one that was on the 3rd day. Abraham sees this place. So he said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey." Now, he only mentions one donkey, so maybe they were walking, and that's why it took so long. "While I and the boy go over there, we will worship, then we will come back to you." He says, "We will come back to you." Again, if I follow Paul's thinking, Abraham really believed that this was the son God had promised, and no matter what God told him to do, the promise would still be there and the son would still be there. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. Isaac, I don't know how old Isaac would be at this time, but definitely a young man, not a 5-year-old, a boy at least in his late teens. So Isaac is carrying the wood up the mountain. Abraham is old, remember. So when you're old like I am, you're not allowed to lift heavy things. So anyway, and Abraham has the fire. You know, they don't have matches or a lighter thing. So they take some fire and put it in a jar and carry it and feed this fire and keep it going, and that's how they're going to start the fire on the altar. He has the fire and the knife. They use a particular knife for the sacrifice. That's a kind of a sacred knife. So he has the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up. Now this is interesting. This is again a boy old enough to and smart enough to look at this and say, he said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. This has to be a really heavy thing for Abraham. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offerings?" So again, I would see from this that Abraham was in the habit of offering lambs in sacrifice to God, even though the text doesn't talk much about that. Now Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And we get to the end of the story, that's very significant. God will provide, because they have a way of coining personal names for God. And out of this, Abraham begins to call God the God who provides. So when they had reached the place God told him about, Abraham built an altar. I presume you take stones and you build this altar up so that you can build the fire on top of it. How long it took to do that, how much he and Isaac were doing that, and Isaac is still saying, "I don't see any lamb." There, he built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. If you're a fire builder, you know you don't just throw the wood on, you arrange it. So you got some starter stuff, and then you arrange it so the fire will burn. Arranged the wood on it. Then he bound his son Isaac. So now Isaac is seeing what's really happening here. And think of how hard this was for Abraham. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Isaac has to somewhat cooperate with this, because old man Abraham is not able, other than by the authority of his fatherhood, he's not able to do this without Isaac being cooperative. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife. He takes the knife to slay his son. But as soon as he took the knife in his hand, and it was obvious that he was intending to do this, the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven. Now here we have it, voice from heaven. "Abraham, Abraham, here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by the horns, not just a little lamb, but a big grown-up male sheep. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." That's the message he carries away from this place. The Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." To this day, if Moses is writing this, the time that they're getting ready to go into the promised land, that he's speaking and writing the book of Deuteronomy, all the way to that time, they still keep saying, "On the mountain." Now, if they're saying that at that time, they're also thinking about Mount Sinai, where God gives the 10 Commandments. "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, now, here again, the text says, in this case, an angel, and yet the words are the words of God. "I swear by myself." Paul again picks this up in Galatians and says, you can swear by something that you think is bigger or greater than you are, though Jesus says not to do that. Let your yes be yes and your no, no. And don't count on swearing by something so people would believe you. If I don't swear, as little kids, we say something, well, our friends don't believe it. cross my heart and hope to die. Well, now they believe you, Well, so I swear by myself. Paul says God can only swear by himself. There's nothing beyond that. I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sands on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba. The wells were named because the well was the center of a place where people were settled. So this well, Beersheba, is where Abraham is settled. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Now, what do you make of this story? Is there something more here? When God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son whom you love, and sacrifice him, do we say, wait a minute, that's what God did. He took his son, his only son whom he loved, and sacrificed him, had him sacrificed. So many people reading this would say this is a prophetic happening, even though your first reaction may be that's a very unfair thing. And you can't imagine Abraham following through with this, and yet he seems to show every intent of following through with it. If God said it, I do it. God will take care of it. But in God's case, he didn't stop. Jesus prayed, if there's some other way, let this cup pass from me, but there was no other way. So anyway, this seems to be a kind of a bookend of Abraham's life, and Paul makes it very clear that Abraham is not saved by doing these things. He does these things because he has a relationship with God that we would call salvation. But James says the only way we know about that faith of Abraham, it's interesting that Paul says to his Gentile believers, okay, they may say you don't qualify because you're not Jews, but he says you're not children of Abraham's genealogies or of his flesh, of his DNA, except he doesn't know anything about DNA. You're children of Abraham's faith. If you have faith like Abraham. And he points out his reasoning in Romans is very interesting. He says when God first calls Abraham, he's not a member of a chosen race. There is no chosen race. Nor is it a matter of circumcision, because it's years before he gives the rite of circumcision. Abraham is just a man who believes God. And Paul says, and that's where it comes down to, that's what we learn from Abraham, that so you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile, whoever you are. You're a person who believes God. And believing God, then God counts it to you for righteousness and makes you his own. Okay, so anything you want to ask or say about this story before we move on? It's the great, well, I have a story that if we get to this morning is more of a favorite of mine. But now, we have a paragraph at the end of chapter 22 that you'd say, well, what's this about? Well, if you read it carefully, you can see what it's about. Sometime later, I don't know whether we're talking about days or years, sometime later, Abraham was told, Milcah is also a mother. She has born sons to your brother Nahor. Abraham, he wasn't getting emails from his brother's family, so he didn't know what was happening. But now somebody, maybe a traveler coming through, maybe this is strictly of God, and God is revealing it to him. Uz, the firstborn, Buz, his brother. Buz? Yeah. And then he lists all these ones. Now, let me tell you what serious theological students do when I was studying this history for the first time. I don't know what translation we're using. I haven't been able to find it, but someplace we had it phrased that 8 sons did Milcah bear. She had 8 sons, and so we said it, 8 sons did Milcah bear. How many sons does it take to milk a bear? 8. Silly people that we were. Yeah, we were serious theological students, but we were silly. Okay, chapter 23 then, Sarah dies. Now, Ed, you were asking about this long life thing. The thing I notice, it's not really an explanation, I just notice it, that before the flood, we're talking about Methuselah, who lived 900 and some years, and all those people before the flood lived long years, except the ones we don't know about. Methuselah died in the year of the flood. Does that mean that he died in the flood, or that God held up the flood until Methuselah was gone? But anyway, then you come down to Abraham, who dies at 175. He's just a kid compared to these pre-flood people. Then you come down to Moses, who dies at 120. And then you finally get down to the Psalms that says, in a man's life shall be 70, or by reason of strength 80. All you strong people who've made it to 80. So it's a declining thing. And then, of course, we know that life expectancy declines. And even though we're talking about at times in history when life expectancy was only 35 or 40, still there were some people who lived to be old in those days. But the lifespan shrinks, and it shrunk, and now it's expanding. I hear comments time and again that, it used to be that when somebody reached 100 years of age, it was national news. Now we have so many people that reach 100 years of age that it's just local news. And I look around me and I see lots of people like myself that are in their 80s and 90s and think, okay, life expectancy has seemed to be growing back. Is it going to grow back to 120 years? I'm not sure that it would do that, but it might. I don't expect it to grow back to 900 years ever. That was something that seemed to have to do with that period, that unusual period of time following the creation. So, but, Ed, I would have to agree with you that when you look at this from an anthropological point of view, you don't see why these ancient peoples would be strong enough to live that many years. It just doesn't seem sensible, but there it is.
About that, too, John, the atmosphere was different.
Oh, yes.
The Earth's atmosphere.
Yes.
You just wonder what it all is. The amount of oxygen was probably different,
Yeah.
So who knows?
Maybe their diets were different. There's a prevailing story that I didn't mention when we were doing this, didn't want to get bogged down, that if you read it, it looks like they were vegetarians until after the flood. It's only after the flood that God talks about eating meat. So I don't know. There are those who say, well, if we were all vegetarians, we'd live long years. If we took care of it properly, but a vegetarian diet does not really guarantee long life unless you manage it.
Yeah.
Okay, so chapter 23, Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. So these places always have multiple names, depends who's naming them. I was interested in my brief college years. I took a class that had to do with the Native Americans, the so-called Indians. And the teacher said, none of the Indian tribes ever gave themselves a name. They didn't need a name. They knew who they were. They named the other tribes. And the names that we have of tribes come from what the other Indian tribes called that tribe. And that's kind of a thing that we don't need a name. I don't have an accent. those people have accents, I'm just a normal person. So anyway, Kiryat Arba, these names did have a lot of meaning to them. Names were very significant. But we have known that place as Hebron, and it's still kind of known as Hebron. In the land of Canaan, generally speaking, this was called the land of Canaan. We will find later that it wasn't all descendants of Cain that lived there. There were some people who lived there who were more like European stock. When we get to the New Testament, we talk about the Galatians. The Galatians are Gauls. The Gauls are the ancestors of the French. So we had some of these tribes coming down and finding good places with better weather in this area and settling in. And we'll see that again. But basically, most of the tribes that were there were of this ethnic stock that we probably now would associate with the Arab peoples and the features and the hair color and stuff. So anyway, Sarah dies in the land of Canaan. Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. Apparently, we'll see that in the next story. Apparently, their tents, it wasn't just one huge tent, they had several tents. So you had a kitchen tent, you had a bedroom tent, and the Sarah had her own tent that she lived in. Abraham had his tent. So he goes to Sarah's tent to weep over her. Still a wonderful devotion between Abraham and Sarah, even up to the time she dies. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. Now, this is all about the Hittites. Who are the Hittites? I always, in college years, when I read this, thought, well, it's another one of these little local groups of people. Then I began to realize, no, the Hittites were a big group of people who came down from Europe someplace and settled in Asia Minor and what is now Turkey. And some of them then came around and settled in the Holy Land. And Abraham seemed to get along better with the Hittites than he did with the Canaanites. And these people that were his neighbors and that provided people to go with him when he was fighting that battle to rescue Lot, they were all Hittites. And the interaction between peoples here is very interesting. So Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am an alien and a stranger among you. Abraham never tried to tell them that this was my land, now God gave it to me. He always said, I'm just a stranger among you, but you've been kind to me and I appreciate that. I'm an alien and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead. The Hittites replied to Abraham, Sir, listen to us. You're a mighty prince among us. They recognized that Abraham was a very unusually gifted and established man. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead. But Abraham didn't want to bury Sarah in somebody else's tomb. He wanted, and it's been well noted, that the only land he ever owns in this land that God said he's going to give him is this field and this cave in which becomes the family burial ground.
John, could I make one comment?
Sure.
I like this little vignette about Abraham mourning Sarah.
Yeah.
It's so human, and
Yep.
we can all relate to it. I think back before I was a Christian, when my mother died, it was an absolutely devastating thing to me when it happened. And my cousin and her husband, who were devout Christians at the time, came up all happy and said, we celebrate with you your mother's homecoming. And I thought, that is the stupidest thing I ever heard. Get out of my face, you know?
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe it. It was just not human. And I could see where they're coming from on one side, they're sorry. but it's not human, you know. I mean, if
Yeah.
you lose a loved one, you lose a child. I mean, I just got an email from one of my father, one of my son-in-law's father. They lost a child, and he's still mourning it. It's like
Well, sure.
40 years later, and he sent out a baby picture of him holding it, you know.
Yeah.
And here it is, 40 years later. It was so devastating. That's not celebrating a homecoming. That's human grief. That's normal, you know.
Yeah.
And so this vignette, to me, is natural human emotion.
Yeah.
Whereas this thing, oh, we're so happy with you, we celebrate, that's just not, that wasn't in the cards. And I'm telling you, I was ready to deck them, you know. It was so irritating to me. I remember it all these years later, you know.
Yeah.
I was interested in the anthropology class that I took in my college years, and they were talking about the development of humankind, and the anthropologists seemed to see when they found indications that a group of people were burying their dead in a specific way, they then said, oh, this is now a culture. Somebody who buries their dead in a specific way is a culture, not just random people. So anyway, yeah, I like the fact that Abraham has this commitment to Sarah, his wife of all these years. And so anyway, Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land. Abraham's very humble. He never is a braggart or anything. The Hittites, he bows down before his neighbors, the Hittites. He said to them, if you're willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf. So he will sell me the cave of, I've always known this as the cave of Machpelah, and I thought, are we in Scotland? No, this is Machpelah. This is definitely not Scottish. The cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you. Now, he's talking to these leaders of the community, and they gather in the city gates and talk things out and make plans. So Ephraim the Hittite was sitting among his people. I'm sure Abraham knew he was there, but this is his way of carrying out a transaction. If you will influence Ephraim, so he will sell me this particular field with the cave. So Ephraim replies to Abraham, in the hearing of all the Hittites. That means if Ephraim says this and the others hear it, it's a contract. He's not going to go back on it. Who had come to the gate of his city. No, my lord, he said, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. Now, to us, that means he's saying, I don't want to sell it to you. I just want to give it to you. But that was not what Abraham wanted. And I think you can see why he didn't. You give somebody something, and you still say, yeah, it really is still my field. And they say that in their culture, saying I give it to you just means I'll relinquish it. I hear you that you want it, the purpose you want it for. Give you the field, and I give you the cave that's in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead. These Hittites are sympathetic that Abraham has lost his wonderful wife of all these years. And again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said, listen to me if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there. He says, no, I want to buy it. I want it to be a contract so it's clear that I have bought it and paid for it and it's mine. Now listen to what Ephraim says. Ephraim answered Abraham, listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver, but what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. He names a price, but he says, oh, what do I care about that money? But Abraham said, now we have a contract. Abraham agreed to Ephraim's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver. Now, commentaries and footnotes will always talk about what this amounted to. But silver changes values daily in our culture. So it's really hard to figure, but apparently it was a significant amount. It was a significant purchase. So Ephraim's field in Machpelah, near Mamre. That Mamre is the place where one of these great trees is, and Mamre is the name of a person who's associated with that. Both the field and the cave in it and all the trees within the borders of the field was deeded. The trees are very significant. To Abraham and as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. Afterward, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. Okay, let's just wander a little bit from this before we go on. How's my time? Yeah, it's getting... Okay. We find out that when Abraham dies, actually Ishmael comes back in spite of the fact that he doesn't get along with anybody, and Ishmael and Isaac bury Abraham in this cave. So now Abraham and Sarah are buried in the cave. Later, Isaac and Rebekah, his wife, are buried in the cave. And then in Egypt, Jacob says, don't leave my bones in Egypt. Take me when you're going to leave this Egypt and you're going to go back to the land God's giving us. Take my bones. So they do. And Joseph says, bury me back there. And they do. And it gets a little confusing. In one place it talks about burying him in the burial spot at Shechem. Well, Shechem is a little different place. But the tradition is that they're all buried in that cave. So down through the centuries, then we come to the time closer to the time of Christ, and we have King Herod, who was a great builder. He was kind of the first one in a long time to have the authority and the money to do things. So he redid the temple, he built palaces for himself. So I'm told that he built a building over this cave. The cave was still identifiable. And it never talks about him seeing the bones in the cave, but he built rooms in there to represent each of the patriarchs that they believed were buried there. Okay, so this is a glorious building. So now we come to the time of the early Christian era, and the Emperor Constantine has a lot of interest in building temples and things, and his mother, Santa Monica, is that his mother, I think, wants to recapture the things from the life of Christ. So they come and get involved, and they put a church inside this building. Now it's a Greek Orthodox kind of church, or at least an Eastern religion kind of church. However, when the history goes on, the Muslims end up in Bethlehem and Hebron are all in Muslim territory. So the church now becomes a mosque. And you really can't, Jews especially, can't go there. So I read that Moshe Dayan led a group secretly back to this cave. It was that important to him. And lowered, there was a little small way you could get in, so he lowered a young girl because she could fit in there with a camera, and she went in and took pictures so the Jews would know. But this cave, I suppose if you Muslims would let you in, you could go visit it now. Okay, now we have a little bit, this next story is one that I love. Abraham was now old and well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed him in every way. He said to his chief servant in his household, I suppose this is the same guy that earlier he said would be his heir, but he's a trusted businessman kind of guy, and he's over all of Abraham's household, the one in charge of all that he had. Put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth. I think that's interesting. Abraham in describing God, says he's the God of heaven and he's also the God of earth. Swear by God that you will get a wife for my son from the daughters, you will not get a wife from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I'm living. The Canaanites were already not the same culture as Abraham and the Hittites. So, and he doesn't talk about a Hittite bride, but he says, I don't want you to intermarry with the people of the land. If this happens, then they would sort of melt in, and they would, as a separate people, they would disappear into the culture of the land. So he says, no, I want you to go back to my relatives, back up there in Hebron, and get a wife for my son Isaac. The servant asked him, is a very practical servant, what if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Shall I take your son back to the country you came from? And Abraham says, no, don't do that. Make sure you do not take my son back there. We got to stay in this land that God is giving us. Abraham said, the Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying, to your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you so that you can get a wife for my son from there. So this is interesting. Now, why put his hand under his thigh? It's a way of making a serious promise. There have been various explanations of that, but none of them that I think are solid enough to say this is what it means. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of his master Abraham and swore on oath to him concerning this matter. I promise you solemnly that I will do that. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and left, taking with him all kinds of good things from his master. He set out for Aram Naharaim, which is again a newer name for the place that otherwise is called, Aram becomes its name down into the future. He made his way to the town of Nahor. That's the town where Abraham's family still is. He had the camels kneel down near the well outside of town. It was toward evening, the time the women go out to draw water. It's hot in the middle of the day, and so in the evening they go out and draw water, so they have water through the night and water for breakfast and through the day. So then he prayed, O Lord God of my master Abraham. Now, these are people who are circumcised to be part of the covenant, and yet they realize that they don't have the relationship with God that Abraham has. So he prays to the God of Abraham. O Lord, God of my master Abraham, give me success today and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I'm standing beside the spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a girl, please let down your jar that I may have a drink, she says, drink, and I'll water your camels too. All kinds of things about that. A camel, having traveled, will drink 25 gallons of water. Okay. And let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. Now, verse 15 says, before he had finished praying, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, and Bethuel is a direct relative of Abraham, who was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. So this would be Abraham's nephew's. The girl was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had ever lain with her. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up again. The servant hurried to meet her. and said, "Please give me a little water from your jar." "Drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. After she had given him a drink, she said, "I will draw water for your camels, too, until they finish drinking." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough. There was a trough there to feed water animals. Ran back to the well to draw more water. How often did she go back and draw water to water these 10 camels? So apparently the servant sees a very beautiful girl, young girl whose life has not been compromised in any way, and she's strong, and she's willing to work. What a find! So she emptied her jar and ran back to the well to draw more water, and drew enough for all of his camels. Without saying a word, the man watched her closely to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. He trusts this sign, and yet he doesn't trust it absolutely. He trusts what he sees, and he sees in this girl a lot of promise. So when the camels had finished drinking, the man took out a gold nose ring weighing a beka. Now, my footnote says this would be like 1/5 of an ounce of gold. A nose ring. Say, a nose ring? Well, yeah, that's what they wore back then. And when we see all the things that young people do now with piercings and stuff, we shouldn't wonder that they wore a nose ring. And 2 gold bracelets weighing 10 shekels. Now, this would be like 4 ounces of gold per bracelet. Then he asked, "Whose daughter are you? Please tell me, is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" His servants with him and the 10 camels. She answered, "I'm the daughter of Bethuel, the son that Milcah bore to Nahor." And she added, "We have plenty of straw and fodder, as well as room for you to spend the night." Pretty open. I guess she knows her family and knows that this will be all right. Then the man bowed down and worshiped the Lord, saying, "Praise be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord led me on this journey in the house of my master's relatives." The girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. Now, Rebecca has a brother named Laban. We're going to learn a lot more about him in later stories. But here, Laban sees the gold, and right away he says, this is something to look into. And Laban, now Rebecca had a brother named Laban, and he hurried out to the man at the spring as soon as he had seen the nose ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms, and had heard Rebecca tell what the man said to her. He went out to the man and found him standing by the camels near the spring. "Come, you who are blessed by the Lord," he said. Now, these are people who do know the true God. "Why are you standing out here? I have prepared the house and a place for the camels." So the man went to the house, and the camels were unloaded. Straw and fodder were brought for the camels, and water for him and his men to wash their feet. Remember the 3 strangers. It's always important to give a traveler water to wash his feet, because they're going to be dusty from the trip. Then food was set before him, and he said, "I will not eat until I have told you what I have to say. I'm not going to eat anything until I do what my master sent me here to do." "Then tell us," Laban said. So he said, "I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has blessed my master abundantly, and he has become wealthy. He has given him sheep and cattle, silver and gold, men servants and maid servants, and camels and donkeys. My master's wife Sarah has borne him a son in her old age, and he has given him everything he owns. And my master made me swear an oath and said, 'You must not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I live, but go to my father's family and to my own clan and get a wife for my son. Then I asked my master, what if the woman will not come back with me? He replied, the Lord before whom I have walked will send his angel with you and make your journey a success, so that you can get a wife for my son from my own clan and from my father's family. Then when you go to my clan, you will be released from my oath. Even if they refuse to give her to you, you will be released from my oath. When I came to the spring, he tells the story again, before I finished praying in my heart, Rebecca came out with her jar on her shoulder. He tells what Rebecca did. And she said that she's the daughter of Bethuel, son of Nahor, whom Milcah bore to him. When I put the ring in her nose and the bracelets on her arm, then I put the ring in her nose and bracelets on, and I bowed down and worshiped the Lord. I praised the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who had led me on the right road to get the granddaughter of my master's brother for his son. Now if you will show kindness and faithfulness to my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, so I may know which way to turn. Laban and Bethuel answered, that's the father and the brother, this is from the Lord. We can say nothing to you one way or the other. Here is Rebekah, take her and go, and let her become the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed. I think they're influenced by all the talk of wealth, but still, they say the Lord is in this. And so when Abraham's servant heard what they said, he bowed down to the ground before the Lord. Then the servant brought out gold and silver jewelry and articles of clothing, gave them to Rebekah. He also gave costly gifts to her brother and her mother. Then he and the men who were with him ate and drank and spent the night there. When they got up the next morning, he said, send me on my way to my master. But her brothers and her mother replied, let the girl remain with us 10 days or so, then you may go. But he said to them, do not detain me now that the Lord has granted success to my journey. Send me on my way so that I may go to my master. Then they said, let's call the girl and ask her about it. So they called Rebekah and asked her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. So they sent her, their sister Rebekah, on her way along with her nurse and Abraham's servants and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, our sister, may you increase to thousands upon thousands. May your offspring possess the gates of their enemies. Then Rebekah and her maids got ready and mounted their camels and went back with the man. So the servant took Rebekah and left. What a story. Wow. Now Isaac had come out from Beer Lahairoi. That's another well where Isaac was living, for he was living in the Negev, in this wilderness area. He went out to the field one evening to meditate. My footnote says we're not really sure what this term meditate implies, but anyway, he's out in the field by himself. And as he looked up, he saw camels approaching. Rebekah also looked up and saw Isaac. She got down from her camel and asked the servant, who's that man in the field coming to meet us? He is my master, the servant announced. So she took her veil and covered herself. Then the servant told Isaac all he had done. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother, Sarah, and he married Rebekah. So she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. What a great story. Run over time. Us young preachers remember that in the New Testament we have this figure, this idea that the church is the bride of Christ. You have this in parables, you have it in the book of Revelation. The church is the bride of Christ. And we sort of saw ourselves as young pastors in training in the role of this servant, saying, we will go and find the people who will be the bride of Christ. And this became a very interestingly applied story, that we saw ourselves as this faithful servant. Go and ask the Lord to lead you to the people that he wants you to work with. So, okay, we're going to pick up next time at chapter 25. We made it through all three of these stories. And we're going to find the death of Abraham, and then how this falls out. And pretty soon then we're going to get to Jacob, and Jacob is a whole nother thing. Very interesting stories about Jacob and his relationship to the Lord. So, okay, any last questions or comments? You're a trusting group. You just trust what I'm just reading it right out of the book, just with some explanation. Okay, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you again for your word. Thank you for the things you did so many centuries, millennia ago, to prepare the way so that through Abraham would come the nation of the Jews, would come the ministry of Jesus, would come the church. And so we thank you that you used Abraham so mightily and used him in these miraculous ways to prepare a way for us. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.